The Odyssey is a poem about memory. When we first meet Odysseus on Calypso's island, we see him struggling to remember home. And he's sitting on the beach crying, thinking about getting back to his wife and his home back on the island of Ithaca. And you would think he would be happy to be shipwrecked on this island with a beautiful goddess, and Calypso is providing everything for him. And in theory, it's a life of perfection. Things are good. But Odysseus remembers, and he chooses the life of mortality and the life of imperfection over the life of godhood that Calypso offers him. In some ways, this is the central struggle of Odysseus, and it's one of the big themes of the Odyssey, because sometimes it's easy to lose track of this, as we're going to hear about Odysseus's travels and all the times he gets shipwrecked and he's getting attacked by cannibals and his men are turning into pigs and cyclops are attacking him. And it's easy to lose track of this idea that much of the adventures of Odysseus here are not just about avoiding danger and sort of the adventure and fighting of it all, but it's a fight against forgetting. It's a constant struggle to not give in to letting go of home. And it's interesting because this theme of memory also connects to how the poem was created in the first place. Classicist Emily Wilson says, quote, "In Greek mythology, memory is said to be the mother of the muses, because poetry, music, and storytelling are all imagined as modes by which people remember the times before they were born." End quote. So we have some very obvious connections between memory and history here. And it's also interesting because the Odyssey has long been thought to have been based on what we call an oral tradition. So much of this story was handed down by storytelling. Poets and performers reciting parts of the Odyssey over the course of decades, maybe hundreds of years. We know that in ancient Greece, public speaking was valued as something that was important for the civics of the city-state, and it's likely that not everybody knew how to read and write, so this oral tradition becomes important, a part of society. And of course, this leads to a whole bunch of questions about Homer, the author of the Odyssey, and there have been all kinds of different types of speculation about Homer. Was he one person? Was he a collection of people? Was the Odyssey originally written down and then performed? Or was it something like we said, where it was spoken and created through this process of poetry and oral vocal performance? And with all those questions, we have this oral tradition in ancient Greece that we're talking about, but how do we also go from an oral tradition like that to the book that I'm holding in my hands right now? All of these questions about Homer are sometimes mixed together and molded into what we call the Homeric Question. So Emily Wilson says, quote, "This takes us to what is known as the Homeric Question, which is really a whole cluster of questions about the composition of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The question is given a capital Q because scholars still disagree on some crucial issues even after a couple centuries of discussion. How exactly did the Homeric poems as we have them emerge from the oral tradition that preceded them? Who was Homer? Was there a single author of the Odyssey or several? Did the same person produce the Iliad and the Odyssey? When exactly did the poems get written down? And how? Can we trace earlier and later parts of the poem or tie particular passages to different geographical locations? And to what extent do the poems reflect real historical events, cultures, and peoples? A real Trojan War or the real Mycenaean civilization of the late Bronze Age Greece? Most generally, How exactly did multiple people over hundreds of years across the Greek-speaking world work together to create this magnificent, challenging, and coherent work of poetic storytelling? End quote. This is going to end up being a disappointment to some, but for people who are more familiar with history, they may not be as annoyed by this, but the answer to a lot of those questions is we are probably never going to know. But what we do have are clues in the text and some historical context that can give us a little bit of insight into good theories on the answers to these Homeric questions. Like we said, we know that ancient Greece had an oral tradition, and in the poem, as you're reading, you're going to notice that there's lots of epithets and there's lots of repetition. We talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but oftentimes before a character's name is spoken, they have an epithet before it, and there's repetition here. So it's Odysseus, the great tactician, or the grand strategist Odysseus, or Odysseus, the great liar. And these are indicators of an oral tradition because in the modern day, we would see this repetition as maybe bad writing or lazy writing, but in an oral society, this repetition is going to facilitate memory, and it's going to allow poets who are telling the story to help them remember. We also know that the Odyssey is a very large work, and it has significant connections to the Iliad, which came before it, also by Homer. And there is a structure and an organized thematic approach to both texts. So for many scholars, they think it would be very unlikely that this was some sort of haphazard construction of too many people over too long a time, because it's just too organized and it's too coherent, and to be honest, it's too good. So we don't necessarily know if this was made by one person or by many people, but we do know that it was almost certainly what's called a unified piece of literature, where this was intentional, and at a certain point it went from oral tradition or bits and pieces of an oral tradition to a written text that's sitting in my hands right now. Was this one guy who was dictating his poem to scholars who were writing this down? Was this multiple poets working in tandem together, similar to how a modern day TV show writer's room might operate? Emily Wilson, for what it's worth, seems to think that this was a poem probably created in tandem by multiple poets and potentially over a long period of time, and then written down. So for what it's worth, that's what she thinks. And we cited her earlier. I think that's something to keep in mind, which is that while the Odyssey was based on this oral tradition, and that almost certainly played a huge role in the creation of the story, at some point this was written down. I mean, all you have to do is hold the book in your hands to realize that one person could not possibly remember all of this purely by memory. I mean, just reciting all 24 books of the Odyssey might take you a full day just to do that. So again, to be able to do that, also to be able to construct the story and keep everything in place and put all the thematic elements in, almost certainly not possible without the aid of writing by a single human. So again, most people theorize multiple people involved in the Odyssey, heavy oral tradition that is based on going back for a long period of time. But eventually you get Homer, who is either one person or multiple people, and at some point they codify the story of the Odyssey and write it down. Scholars seem to think that the poem was probably composed sometime around 700 BC, and it's possible that different versions and variations were floating around the Mediterranean, and there's poets and performers reciting these poems in different ways, and you would have had what we might call poetry competitions and these types of things. So there were different versions of the story going around, but at a certain point, there's a very similar version of the story, and we know this historically by the time of Plato and Aristotle. There's more or less a singular story, singular version of the Odyssey, and from there we get minor variations and translations and things like this over the course of hundreds of years. So all of that is a little bit of context to this Homeric question and maybe how the Odyssey was created. And it's interesting because this journey of memory and recitation and creation that the Odyssey went on to become a unified text is mirrored by the journey that Odysseus goes on in the Odyssey. Just as memory almost certainly played a role in the oral tradition that the Odyssey came from, as Odysseus in the story is getting blown all across the sea and ending up in all these exotic places and fighting his way out of danger, he's also journeying more deeply into his own memories and into himself. There's a lot of questions of personal identity. Just who is this guy, Odysseus? And as we're going to see, he is so many different things all at once, and it can be confusing. This idea is something to pay attention to as we get a closer look at Odysseus in Book 6 of the Odyssey. Like we said, he left Calypso's island and he ends up getting shipwrecked into this island of the Phaeacians. These people are kind of godlike. The kingdom seems pretty much perfect. There's not a lot of strife or sorrow from what Odysseus can see, but some scholars see this as this transition zone. Odysseus goes from Calypso's island, which is essentially the world of the gods, and he's going to have to go back to Ithaca, which is, of course, the real world of men. And the Phaeacians are sort of this in-between zone where they're almost half human, half god, and this allows us as an audience to transition from that world of gods to the world of men. And it allows Odysseus to get back in the swing of things, so to speak, and prepare himself for what he's going to find when he gets back to Ithaca. When we last left, Odysseus was naked, sleeping in the forest, and he's going to wake up to the sound of a beautiful woman by the name of Nausicaa and her slave girls doing laundry in the river. So this is our first real dilemma that we're going to watch Odysseus try to wiggle himself out of. He's completely naked. Remember that he's been shipwrecked for, I think, 2 or 3 weeks at this point, and he probably smells, he looks terrible. He doesn't want to scare these girls, and he doesn't want to come off as improper. Obviously, he's naked, and that could be weird. So he has to figure out how to approach Nausicaa. Now, luckily for him, Athena has already manipulated Nausicaa by, first of all, telling her to go do laundry at that particular place where she's going to run into Odysseus, but she had also sent Nausicaa some dreams and maybe some foreshadowing, stoking up her hopes of marriage. So Nausicaa may have been primed to look at Odysseus in a favorable light. And at any rate, Odysseus comes out of the bushes, half naked, and delivers maybe the greatest pickup line in world history, absolutely demonstrating why Odysseus is the great tactician and a smooth operator. Frat boys everywhere should have paid more attention to English class just to get this pickup line. Odysseus keeps his distance from Nausicaa, but he delivers this line. Quote, "Mistress, please, are you divine or mortal? If one of those who dwell in the wide heaven, You are most near to Artemis, I should say, great Zeus's daughter, in your grace and presence. If you are one of Earth's inhabitants, how blessed your father, and how gentle mother, blessed all your kin. I know what happiness must send the warm tears to their eyes each time they see their wondrous child go to the dancing. But one man's destiny is more than blessed, he who prevails and takes you as his bride. Never have I laid eyes on equal beauty in man or woman. I am hushed indeed. So fair, one time I thought a young palm tree at Delos near the altar of Apollo. I had troops under me when I was there on the sea route that later brought me grief, but that slim palm tree filled my heart with wonder. Never came shoot from earth so beautiful. So now, my lady, I stand in awe so great I cannot take your knees. End quote. Odysseus then goes on to explain what happened to him and why he's there, and he asks for help to get cleaned up and maybe get some food and shelter. Here's another case where Odysseus uses flattery to put a beautiful woman maybe on her back foot a little bit and hopefully into a mental state where she's a little bit more likely to help him. We saw this first with Calypso, where Odysseus was praising how Penelope could never compare to Calypso's beauty. And he was saying this because he knew he was going to need Calypso to get a ride home. And in a similar way, we see him use this strategy with Nausicaa as well. Now, Nausicaa extends this concept of guest right to him immediately. So she puts him under her protection, saying, quote, "This man is lost, poor thing. We must look after him. All foreigners and beggars come from Zeus, and any act of kindness is a blessing. So give the stranger food and drink, and wash him down in the river, sheltered from the wind." End quote. So as Nausicaa says there, she's going to have her slave girls, who are probably young and pretty, bathe him, and Odysseus tells them to go away. Again, the great tactician is keeping his eyes on the prize, and he knows he's going to have to go to the king of this place of Phaeacia, and he doesn't want to give any appearance of impropriety. So he doesn't want to seem like he's courting Nausicaa too much. He doesn't want to get a bath from the slave girls and maybe something improper happens. And he's very cunning about all this. Nausicaa will also tell him how to get to the palace so that people don't make assumptions about the two of them. So when they head back towards the palace, Odysseus kind of stays behind a little bit, and then he goes and hangs out in the temple of Athena for a little bit, and finally he makes it to the palace. And as Nausicaa tells him, the key to him getting home is going to be impressing and supplicating the queen. She seems to run the show to some extent in this kingdom of Phaeacia. The king is a guy named Alcinous, and when Odysseus gets to the great hall, he throws his arms around the knees of the queen and he asks for help. He says, quote, "Grant me passage to my fatherland. My home and friends lie far. My life is pain." End quote. Odysseus doesn't give the full story of his travels yet, but he does tell Alcinous about Calypso's island, and he says that in his heart he never gave consent to Calypso, basically framing himself as a prisoner there. He expresses his grief and his sorrow over all the things that have happened to him so far. Surely he's remembering his shipmates and his friends that were killed in the Trojan War and then killed in shipwrecks and all the misadventures that he got into before Calypso's island. But again, Odysseus is very tactful here, and he's worried that Alcinous will be angry that Odysseus might have a little something going on with his daughter Nausicaa. Odysseus makes sure to mention that nothing improper happened on the beach with him and Nausicaa or the other girls. And Alcinous says, "I'm a reasonable man and I believe in rationality and a sense of measure in things." And really everybody here seems to like Odysseus a lot, so they agree we're going to send him home. Alcinous promises a ship of Phoenicians to send Odysseus back to Ithaca and says, hey, let's finish feasting tonight. Let's go to bed. Tomorrow you can tell me more of your story, and then you can go home from there. The next day in the feasting hall, Odysseus kind of breaks down crying when the poet or the singer sings of the exploits of the Trojan War. In particular, Achilles and Agamemnon, who are both dead now. And Alcinous recognizes that Odysseus is breaking down. He's not sure why. He actually doesn't know who Odysseus is yet. He just knows that he's a guest in need of help. But Alcinous notices that Odysseus is struggling here, and he kind of shifts the attention of everyone to, hey, let's go play some Olympic-style games. So there's running, there's jumping, there's wrestling, boxing, discus, and I guess the Phaeacian court has these games that they put on, especially when guests are there. At a certain point, Odysseus, as he's watching, gets taunted by one of the lesser nobles in the court, a younger guy by the name of Euryalus. Some translations call him Sea Reach, but Euryalus is noticing that Odysseus isn't playing any of the games. He's wondering if Odysseus is a bit of a coward, or maybe he's just not very athletic. But in any case, this really ticks off Odysseus. Remember that he is a veteran of the Trojan War, and he was just very upset about the song where the poet was singing about Achilles and Agamemnon. And now you have this young kid who has no experience in the Trojan War and is going to insult a war hero without knowing anything about him. And you can tell this really ticks off Odysseus because up to this point in the story, Odysseus very rarely gets angry. But again, even though he's angry, Odysseus allows his reason and his rationality to dictate his emotions and control his passions. How he handles this fool, Sea Reach, says a lot about Odysseus. First of all, Odysseus makes sure that he never challenges Alcinous, the king, or Laodamas, his son, so that way he stays in the good graces of his hosts. But Odysseus does feel like he has to respond to this Euryalus guy. He says, quote, "That was uncalled for, friend. You talk like a fool. The gods deal out no gift, this one or any, birth, brains, or speech, to every man alike. In looks, a man may be a shade, a specter, and yet be master of speech, so crowned with beauty that people gaze at him with pleasure. Courteous, sure of himself, he can command assemblies, and when he comes to town, the crowds gather. A handsome man, contrawise, may lack grace and good sense in everything he says. You now, for instance, with your fine physique, a god's indeed, you have an empty noodle. I find my heart inside my ribs aroused by your impertinence. I am no stranger to contests, as you fancy. I rated well when I could count on my youth in my two hands. Now pain has cramped me, and my years of combat hacking through ranks and war and the bitter sea. Aye, even so I'll give your games a trial. You spoke heart-wounding words. You shall be answered." End quote. Odysseus throws off his cloak and picks up the discus and throws it further than anybody has ever thrown it in all of Phaeacia, apparently. Perhaps getting some help from Athena in that case. Later on, at the feast for that night, Alcinous the king makes Euryalus apologize to Odysseus, and all of the people of Phaeacia are giving Odysseus gifts, and Euryalus is supposed to give Odysseus a gift as well. And the gift Euryalus gives Odysseus is a sword. And so Odysseus, ever the great tactician, forgives Sea Reach in front of everybody, but he also says something to the effect of, hey, thanks for the sword. It looks like a great weapon. I hope you're not ever in a position where you wish you had it back. So he's kind of thanking Euryalus for the sword, but he's also saying, be careful if you ever find yourself in a position where you need a sword and I'm in the same room as you. I think this moment with Euryalus and Odysseus demonstrating his athleticism and then his smarts and then kind of the subtle threat at the end, I think it foreshadows a little bit what is coming for the suitors back on the island of Ithaca. So Homer does a nice job here of setting up Odysseus as, yes, this very wise, very tactical mind, but we have to remember that he's also a hardened war veteran and a killer. And we don't see that fully here yet, but we will. And I think Homer is preparing us for that. Odysseus then cooks up one more scheme where he gives the poet some of the delicious meat that everybody else is eating as a gift. And then he asks for a song about the Trojan horse and Odysseus's role at the end of the Trojan War. The poet starts singing about the Greeks sneaking the horse into Troy and all the soldiers pouring out of the giant contraption and Odysseus playing this huge role in it. And as he's singing the song, Odysseus starts crying. And it might be some kind of scheme where Odysseus is trying to garner affection from Alcinous before he reveals who he is and why he's on his journey home. Again, he might be subtly prompting Alcinous to be sympathetic towards him as this emotional song of the Trojan War is playing, just to grease the skids one more time before Alcinous decides to put him on a ship home. Odysseus is always thinking, he's always a step ahead, and he's always keeping his end goal of going home in mind, or at least trying to. In Emily Wilson's translations, she uses the epithet, the master of lies, a couple times, and she also uses the epithet, the clever mastermind of many schemes. And it turns out Odysseus is smart for this particular scheme because although Alcinous respects Odysseus, at the end of the feast, he really wants more information about Odysseus's story. And Alcinous reveals that there's a prophecy of sorts that Poseidon is going to wreck one of the Phaeacian ships in the future that Poseidon has a vendetta against. Who is this guy? Has he angered anyone? Does he have any enemies on Olympus? And so finally, Odysseus has to tell the story of how he got from the end of the Trojan War to Calypso's island. And what a story it is. Now, it's important to note here that we're now in book 9 of the Odyssey, and for the next couple of books, the perspective of narration shifts to Odysseus's point of view. And there's a lot of people who think that we need to treat Odysseus as somewhat of an unreliable narrator because he's telling the story from his perspective, and always remember that he is the great tactician, right? And he is the master of lies. So he might be spinning certain things that happen in the story a certain way in order to suit his audience, or maybe even to suit himself and his own memories and his own personal identity. But at any rate, he finally tells the story. So it all started after the end of the Trojan War, and on his way home, Odysseus and his ships plunder a town called the Cicones. Odysseus says, quote, "I sacked the town and killed the men. We took their wives and shared their riches equally among us." End quote. But in the aftermath of this great plundering, his crew gets too drunk and they slaughter too many cows and sheep while an army is roused against them and they have to flee. Now, if you're familiar with the context of the ancient world and the context of the ancient Greek world, this story of plundering will fit in with your understanding of the Mediterranean world more broadly. So a modern look at them just plundering this town and taking the women and slaughtering people and taking all the animals, that might seem weird to us, but we have to remember that this was a fundamental part of the Mediterranean world. And warfare in particular was a fundamental part of politics, economics, and society in all of these city-states in ancient Greece. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody was plundering and robbing and looting city-states all over the place, but it did mean that troops in war, or maybe even troops coming home from war, would have something like this be on the menu for them. And it tells you something about the difference between modern morals and the morals of the ancient world, that this was just a rousing good time back then. But in the story, it's also interesting to look at this incident with the Cicones because it compares with this idea of guest rite, or what the Greeks might call xenia. Obviously, it's hugely important for the story. We talked about Telemachus extending guest rite to his guests, and we talked about the kings that Telemachus visits extending him guest rite, and we see it with Calypso giving it to Odysseus when he washes up, and we see it with Alcinous giving it to Odysseus when he washes up on the Phaeacian island. And this is what is expected. When you have a guest, you treat them appropriately, you give them food, you bathe them, you give them shelter, and then you send them on their way. Something to think about as Odysseus talks about robbing and plundering the Cicones. When does guest rite apply? When does it not apply? And what are the differences in those scenarios or situations? Back to the story, Zeus is pissed and he doesn't like the way that they slaughtered too many cows while on the island, and he makes a storm that's going to shipwreck Odysseus and a lot of his crew. They end up coming to what they call the Lotus Eater Island. On Lotus Eater Island, there exists a people called the Lotus Eaters who eat this special plant called the lotus. And the lotus makes you forget about home. It makes you forget where you come from, and it takes away those most precious memories. And like we said at the beginning of this episode, we have to remember that the Odyssey at its core is a story about going home. And what that means is it's about keeping your memories intact, because there can be no home without memories of your home. Odysseus loves the concept of home. At one point he asks, quote, "Where shall a man find sweetness to surpass his own home and his parents?" End quote. On Calypso's island, he made what he thinks is that noble decision of denouncing immortal life and infinite wealth and beauty with Calypso, and denouncing all that in order to return home. Odysseus watches as his own crewmen are eating the honeyed sweet plant, and they're forgetting about their home, and they're becoming lost, which has to just be the ultimate torture for Odysseus. Again, because it's not just your home, it's your values, it's your family, your friends, your memories, your childhood. But even so, one of the themes of the Odyssey is that a lot of the stuff that goes along with the theme of memory and remembering home is unpleasant. And that's why the lotus plant is so attractive. To be able to instantly enter a life of ease, not having to worry about the past or the things that got you where you are today. And again, this was a deal that Odysseus rejected with Calypso, but here he has to literally abduct his own crewmen and tie them down in order to bring them home. So they flee and they carry on to the next location, which ends up being the island of the Cyclops, which is one of the most famous in all of ancient literature and really all of narrative storytelling in general. Odysseus and his crew land on, I guess, a smaller island, a little bit offshore of the main island where they can observe the Cyclops. And Odysseus is not particularly impressed by this race of Cyclops. He views them as barbarians. They don't farm the way that the Greeks farmed. They don't build ships. They don't hold councils. They, maybe most importantly for Odysseus, don't fear or worship Zeus or any of the gods. And they're much more individualistic. Each Cyclops lives in his own cave by himself, and they each have their own herds of rams and sheep that they shepherd. And you can sense that there's not much of a sense of community or city-state from these Cyclops. And so Odysseus' plan is to go into one of these Cyclops caves, talk to the Cyclops, demand help, demand gifts, and hopefully get the supplies and nourishment that they need to continue on their journey. Now, as we know, that's going to end up being a terrible plan, but I think we have to keep in mind the historical context of why Odysseus would be making this decision. So in the ancient Greek world, there is a theme of colonization. And over time, Greek city-states were extending their zones of influence in a very similar process to what we would think of in the modern day as colonialism. They would go to parts of Sicily or other coastal areas in the Mediterranean, and they would essentially set up what we might think of as colonies, extending their culture and their habits as far as politics and ways of life and farming. And one of the justifications for colonialism really throughout history is that the people who are being colonized often are seen as needing to be colonized. The colonizing group usually views their morals and their society as superior, and that's why they have to bring it to a lesser, quote unquote, more barbaric area. So Odysseus's interactions with the Cyclops fit into this colonial worldview where the Cyclops are depicted as these barbarians because they don't farm the same way the Greeks do. And from one perspective, Odysseus comes into this guy's house uninvited, injures him, takes his stuff, and then leaves. And that feels like it could be read as a Greek colonial story. Now, all that being said, the Cyclops himself, a guy by the name of Polyphemus, is not the most accommodating host. Odysseus brings a few of his men to go investigate the Cyclops cave. They invite themselves inside without asking, and they kind of set up a fire and just wait for Polyphemus to get home. Odysseus didn't bring much with him, but he did bring this ultra strong wine that he got from somewhere else on the journey, and he suspects he may have to use it to outsmart this giant man who lacks knowledge of what Odysseus would say are quote unquote normal customs. So the Cyclops comes home, and immediately he's not extending guest right to Odysseus at all. Odysseus demands a gift. Polyphemus says no, and he locks the door to his cave by rolling a giant boulder in front of it, and he basically just starts beginning to kill and eat Odysseus's men slowly over time. So right away, Polyphemus is an interesting foil to characters like Alcinous who help Odysseus, and we see that the villains in the story of the Odyssey do very poorly with this idea of guest rite and xenia. In this world, a good person helps strangers and those in need, and a bad person does not. So we are expected to sympathize with Odysseus here and think that Polyphemus is the villain. Could Odysseus have been a little bit better of a guest, maybe, and played his role a little bit better? Yes, maybe by not going in the cave right away without asking, and maybe by not demanding a gift right away. But again, it doesn't seem like Polyphemus would have been accommodating to Odysseus or his men anyway. So Odysseus forms a plan. The Cyclops is huge, and Odysseus would have no chance against him in hand-to-hand combat. The whole group of men would have no chance. So Odysseus' plan is he's going to sharpen Polyphemus' walking stick. He's going to trick him into drinking the extra strong wine. And then he's going to stab him through the eye with the giant walking stick. Another piece of the plan here is that when the Cyclops asks for Odysseus' name, Odysseus says that his name is Nobody, or some translations will say no man. Odysseus offers some of the wine to Polyphemus, who loves it, and he drinks some more. Sure enough, he passes out. Odysseus takes some of his men, and together they ram the sharpened stick into Polyphemus' eye, blinding him. Then they hide in the cave, and the next morning, when Polyphemus rolls away the stone of the cave, they tie themselves to the bellies of the rams that Polyphemus is herding, and they sneak out that way. It's a clever trick because as Polyphemus is yelling in rage after he got stabbed in the eye that he's been blinded, his Cyclops neighbors come to see what all the commotion is about, and Polyphemus is yelling that nobody did anything to him and nobody hurt him and nobody stabbed him in the eye. So the other Cyclops, hearing that nobody did anything, figure, okay, nothing's happening, and they go home. So it's another clever trick by Odysseus, and again, like we said, they sneak out under the bellies of the rams, and Odysseus makes it to his boat, and in one of the rare moments, again, Odysseus shows his anger, and he probably lets it get the better of him in this situation. So Odysseus is angered that the Cyclops violated guest rite and obviously ate some of Odysseus' men, and Odysseus kind of lets his anger fly here. He tells the Cyclops his name. He says, "I am Odysseus. I'm the guy who beat you." And the Cyclops starts hurling boulders at the ship, and they almost get hit, and they almost get shipwrecked again. Then Odysseus waits a little bit until the ship's out of range, and he berates the Cyclops again. And the Cyclops curses him. And it turns out that Polyphemus is the son of Poseidon, and Poseidon is not going to like this, and he's going to take it out on Odysseus. Generally, it's not a good idea to tick off Poseidon, who basically controls the seas, when you're trying to sail home. So this is going to be a notable plot point going forward. Like we said, this is a very famous part of the Odyssey, and it really serves to show that Odysseus is this tactician where he's able to take down this giant behemoth using pretty much only his wits. Like we said, it also highlights this theme of guest rite, and because Polyphemus doesn't give any gifts to Odysseus or doesn't allow the men to sleep under his roof or provide protection to them, he should be seen as a villain. But I think there's also something here about this idea of Odysseus calling himself nobody or no man. There's a connection to personal identity, because we're still pretty early in the story of the Odyssey, and this is one of the first stories that Odysseus is telling to Alcinous. And we're all learning about this guy. Who is Odysseus? On the one hand, this guy is favored by the gods for sure. And at times he's depicted as one of those sort of almost half god, half mortal type of people. But on the other hand, he's just a guy. He uses his powers of wit and reason and strategy and thinking. And we all have these abilities to one degree or another. But for Odysseus, there's a murkiness here. Just like with this liminal boundary between the world of gods and the world of men in the ancient Greek world, we might question what defines Odysseus. Again, his intellect and his mind, but also his martial prowess and his killing abilities. Maybe what defines him most is his will to go home. But you have to wonder if Odysseus himself isn't wondering what is home. Things may have changed. How certain is he that everything can be put back in place the way it was before he left for the war? Is he the same person now as when he left for the Trojan War? What about Penelope? Is she still loyal to him? How have things changed for her in his absence? And again, you have to wonder if these questions of personal identity aren't connected to Odysseus, and you have to wonder if these aren't things that he's thinking about as he's recalling this journey that he's been on and as he's living the journey that he was on. So this concept of nobody is not just a fun trick to escape the cyclops and show us Odysseus's great powers of deception. I think it's also deeply connected to thinking about who this person is as a person, and it gives us some insight into what he may be thinking of himself under the surface. Another piece from the story of Odysseus and the cyclops here, I think, is that in this world of Homer's Greece, and maybe in our own world, I think there's a very thin line between civility and violence. Once the guest rite is violated, it's not long before the Cyclops is eating people and Odysseus is ramming sharpened stakes through Cyclops' eyes. So there could be a little bit of foreshadowing here with Odysseus and what happens when he views guest rite being violated. There's very much an undercurrent of violence and brutality that runs the thread of the Odyssey. And I think that's highlighted here in this part of the story. And obviously it's going to show up in a big way later on as well. After barely making it out of Polyphemus' lair and the Cyclops Island, Odysseus and his crew end up at Aeolus' palace, and Aeolus controls the wind. So Aeolus receives Odysseus and gives him guest rite, and he actually bottles up the wind for Odysseus, and this is going to propel the crew all the way back to Ithaca. So they're sailing on the back of this wind that they've been given, and they can see Ithaca. Literally, it says they can see the fires of the men who are doing things on the island. And right then, Odysseus falls asleep because he's tired, and his men get jealous of him, and they think that there might be some kind of gold and silver in the bag that Aeolus gave him that controls the wind, but they think they might be hiding silver and gold in there. And so they open up the bag, and this unleashes the wind on the crew, and they go flying all the way back to Aeolus' island, who then shuns them, says they're cursed by the gods, basically tells them to go away. And just like that, one step forward, two steps backwards. They end up at a place called Laestrygonia. The Laestrygonians are cannibals. So they land on this island full of cannibals, and a couple of their guys end up getting eaten, and they have to fight their way off the island and flee once again. Aside from being terrifying, I think there's a lot of imagery in the story of the Odyssey about being eaten. again, in addition to just being a terrible way to go, there's something here about the imagery of food and eating and having that be connected to death, which I think is interesting. Obviously, the Cyclops in the story is a villain, and part of that is because he doesn't extend guest right to Odysseus, but I think another part of it is that he eats Odysseus's men. We've already seen that the slaughtering of cows and animals is important, and the proper rituals to observe when doing that are important. And if you don't do it properly, you can anger even someone as high up as Zeus. And so it should be noted that this Homeric world is a world where feasting and eating has a ritual to it, and it's important to society as a whole. And the people who don't observe this ritual are seen as dangerous. In the real ancient Greece, there was singing and dancing and sex that would often accompany these feasts, and it was believed that the gods loved the smoke that would come up from these animal sacrifices. And of course, that's convenient because then the Greeks could eat the meat and continue to party. At any rate, Odysseus and his men escape the cannibal island, and their next landing spot is the island of Circe. Circe is a beautiful witch. She lives with animals. Wolves and lions obey her command and live with her. And as it happens, she likes to turn men who visit her into animals and into her playthings. So Odysseus and his men show up on the island, and they're talking about what they're seeing, and some of his men, one in particular, are not very keen to go walking into the lair of this beautiful witch who turns men into pigs. And so they draw lots, and eventually a group that does not include Odysseus approaches the witch's house. Circe lures the men in with promises of wine and songs and food and, of course, her beauty. And it's an example here maybe of a theme that's also emerging, which is that things that are good require adversity. And sometimes if it's simple and it's beautiful and it's easy, it can be a trap. Odysseus describes what happens next. He says, quote, "She came swiftly to the shining doors to call them in, all but Eurylochus, who feared a snare. The innocents went after her. On thrones she seated them, and lounging chairs, while she prepared a meal of cheese and barley and amber honey mixed with Pramnian wine, adding her own vile pinch to make them lose desire or thought of our dear fatherland. Scarce had they drunk when she flew after them with her long stick and shut them in a pigsty, bodies, voices, heads, and bristles, all swinish now, though minds were still unchanged. So squealing, in they went, and Circe tossed them acorns, mast, and cornel berries, fodder for hogs who rut and slumber on the earth." End quote. Circe makes her move, which is to poison the wine, turn them into pigs, throw them in the pigsty, and then have an unquestioning and obedient group of slaves, basically. Eurylochus comes running down to the ship to tell Odysseus what happened, and luckily Odysseus is counseled by the god Hermes, and Hermes gives him an antidote for the poison and basically tells him that you can use your sex appeal to appease Circe and slowly wear her down. Now, that guy Eurylochus, who was against going to Circe's hut in the first place, he doesn't like this idea, and he warns Odysseus that they're all going to get sucked into Circe's schemes. Odysseus gets really mad at him, but ultimately Eurylochus goes with Odysseus, and Odysseus does execute the plan. So he drinks the antidote, and when Circe goes to turn him into a pig, he is able to resist her and basically threaten to kill her. Circe immediately wants to sleep with him, which is what Hermes said would happen. And Odysseus says he'll do it as long as you guarantee the safety of my men. The line in the Fitzgerald translation is, quote, being a man, he consented, end quote. But it turns out Eurylochus was right. Before anyone knows what happened, a year goes by. Circe wasn't able to use the poison on Odysseus, but she was able to lure him in with promises of ease and feasting and joy, and of course, access to her beauty and sex. And eventually a year goes by and Odysseus essentially forgot all thoughts of home. His captains had to intervene, and eventually they convince him to plead with Circe to go home. Circe agrees and also tells Odysseus that he needs to go to the land of death and visit Persephone, and in particular this prophet of death, Tiresias, before the gods are going to allow him to go home. But before Odysseus and his crew can leave, one of their men, Elpenor, is on the top level of Circe's house, and he's drunk, and he ends up accidentally falling over and falling to the floor and killing himself. So there's often a parable of warning to men about this is what a beautiful woman can turn you into if you're not careful, and Elpenor is sort of the symbolic example of somebody falling from grace. But I think there's a lot more to Circe, and I think there's a lot more to this section of the Odyssey than just that. Circe offers Odysseus and his men what Calypso offered Odysseus before him, what Helen of Troy offers to her kingdom and offered to Menelaus, and also what the Lotus eaters offer to anyone who eats the lotus. Circe is offering the taste of Elysium, a life of ease and simplicity, wine and feasting and beauty, and maybe most importantly, a release from the trappings of the world, the dangers and the injustices and all the things that are wrong in society. And again, a lot of this is contrasted with the fleeting nature of the mortal world, right? Where the petty nature of mortality exists, but also where home exists and memory exists. It's interesting that in some ways the thematic antagonist or the thematic enemy in the Odyssey is this theme that keeps popping up of losing track of home or submersing yourself so deep into pleasure and slothfulness that you forget the past. And it pops up over and over. Classicist D.S. Carne-Ross says, quote, there were those who were willing to accept the ground-leg existence offered by the Lotus Eaters and had to be driven back wailing to their ships. Odysseus himself accepted the slothful ease that Calypso offered, and he does the same thing here, spending a year as Circe's lover and getting underway again only when his men reproach him. Captain, shake off this trance and think of home. Even his iron will can be softened, as Menelaus's will was softened by Helen, who, like Circe, adds to the wine she offers her guests a substance that allays sorrow, a milder form of Circe's potion, but working to the same end, a variation of the same theme. End quote. As he says there, Circe as a character really plays into that theme, which is central to the Odyssey, and I think that makes her all the more interesting. Another element of Circe's character that is hard to ignore, especially in the modern day, is this question of, is Odysseus cheating on Penelope or not? And in some ways, it's pretty straightforward that obviously he is, but in other ways, it's a little more complicated. And there's other questions that go into that question, right? Like the gender roles of the time in ancient Greece. We know that it was a male-dominated society in terms of politics and society and economics and all the things that go into power dynamics. So Odysseus doesn't seem to think twice when he's telling a story about sleeping with Calypso or sleeping with Circe or looting the Cicones and taking the women in that case. And there is a double standard because we know that for Odysseus, Penelope remaining loyal to him is incredibly important. And we told that story of Agamemnon where he goes home and it turns out his wife had been sleeping with the advisor and then the advisor kills him, and that's Odysseus's worst fear. So the fact that Penelope remained loyal is the thing that is central to what makes her a virtuous character in the eyes of many of the men in the story. So the women like Circe and Calypso, who are in Odysseus's eyes in the way of that, are going to be depicted as these sort of corrupt and lustful witches. But I do think it's only fair to keep in mind that double standard, that if Penelope did the things that Odysseus did, would Odysseus think the same of her? You have to imagine the answer is probably no. Now, another question that goes into this question of is Odysseus cheating or not kind of relates to this larger theme of free will versus determinism in the Greek world of mythology. Is it cheating if you are ordered to do so by a god, or if you really have no choice but to do it to save your men? And as Odysseus finds himself in yet another situation where a beautiful goddess has to woo him, and Odysseus to himself is like, all right, I guess if I have to have sex with another beautiful goddess, I will. I do think it's important to remember that this part of the story is being narrated by Odysseus himself. So is it possible that he's an unreliable narrator and maybe he's telling the story in a particular way to give him appropriate motivations and justifications for the things that he's doing? That's a possibility. Again, the same trap he fell into with Calypso is now the trap he fell into with Circe, and a year later he's forgotten of home and he's been kind of absorbed into Circe's beauty and lifestyle, and his captains have to slap him upside the head a little bit and say, hey, we got to get home, man. So maybe even the great Odysseus can have moments where he drifts off course and forgets who he is and forgets where he comes from. But to make it home, he knows that he can't fall into that trap, and he's going to have to remember. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes, video essays, behind-the-scenes content, and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways by subscribing and leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for my email newsletter, which has some written pieces and podcast updates every now and then. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. That's it for now.